13 years. That's how long it had been since Marcus walked out on me with nothing but a handwritten note that said, "I can't do this anymore." 13 years of rebuilding my life from the ashes he left behind. So when he showed up at my Uncle Raymond's while reading last Tuesday, flashing that same charming smile that once made me believe in forever, and had the audacity to say, "We're one," like we were still married. Well, let's just say karma has a twisted sense of timing. Hey everyone, if you're watching this from your cozy living room or maybe during your lunch break, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. This story, it's going to take you on a ride, and honestly, I need to know I'm not alone in this. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and revenge. If stories about justice, betrayal, and second chances hit you right in the gut, hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, you're going to want to follow this journey to the end, and I promise you, the ending will leave you speechless. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I should probably start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like a lifetime ago now. I was 26 when Marcus Thompson swept into my life like a hurricane disguised as a gentle breeze. I was working double shifts at St. Mary's Hospital as a registered nurse, trying to pay off my student loans while living in a studio apartment that smelled perpetually of the Indian restaurant downstairs. Marcus was different from anyone I'd ever met. He had these green eyes that seemed to see right through you, and when he smiled, it was like he was sharing a secret meant just for you. He was a financial advisor then, working at a small firm downtown, driving a used Honda Civic and wearing ties he'd bought at discount stores. We were both scraping by, both dreaming of something bigger, and maybe that's what drew us together, two people determined to climb out of the hole life had dug for us. Our first date was at Mel's Diner on 4th Street. I remember because I spilled ketchup on my white blouse, and instead of being embarrassed, Marcus just laughed and said it looked like modern art. He told me about his plans to start his own investment company someday, how he was studying for additional certifications at night, how he wanted to build something that mattered. I told him about my dream of becoming a nurse practitioner, maybe opening a community health clinic in an underserved area. We talked until the diner closed, and then we sat in his car outside my apartment building for another 2 hours. That night, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the intoxicating possibility that I wasn't meant to navigate this world alone. 6 months later, Marcus proposed with a ring he'd saved for 8 months to buy. It wasn't much, a small diamond on a silver band, but when he got down on one knee in the park where we'd had our first picnic, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. We were married 3 months after that in a small ceremony at the community center, with my Uncle Raymond walking me down the aisle since my parents had passed away in a car accident when I was 19. Uncle Raymond. I should tell you about him because he becomes important later, more important than I could have ever imagined. He was my father's younger brother, and after my parents died, he was the only family I had left. Raymond was eccentric is the kind way to put it. He was a tech entrepreneur who'd made his first million in the early days of the internet, then lost it all, then made it back 10 times over with a series of startups that seemed to exist in industries I couldn't even pronounce. He lived alone in this massive house in the hills outside the city, surrounded by gadgets and inventions and half-finished projects that made no sense to anyone but him. People in town called him the crazy rich hermit, but to me, he was just Uncle Ray, the man who sent me care packages during nursing school and remembered every birthday with a card that contained exactly the amount of money I needed most. Marcus tolerated Uncle Raymond, but I could tell he found him strange. During family dinners, Marcus would smile politely while Uncle Ray rambled about cryptocurrency or sustainable energy or whatever obsession had captured his attention that week. But Uncle Ray saw something in Marcus that I was too in love to recognize. I remember one Christmas dinner when Marcus excused himself to take a work call, on Christmas Day, and Uncle Ray leaned over to me and said, "Rebecca, honey, success changes people. Make sure you know who you're succeeding with." I should have listened to him. The first 3 years of our marriage were beautiful in that exhausting way that young love often is. We worked constantly, Marcus climbing the ladder at his firm while studying for his CFA, me pulling night shifts and weekend doubles to help pay for his certifications. We lived off takeout and dreams, falling asleep on the couch while watching Netflix, talking about the house we'd buy someday, the kids we'd have, the life we were building together. Marcus got his first big break when he was 29. A client he'd been working with introduced him to some wealthy investors who were looking for a young, hungry advisor to manage a portion of their portfolios. The commission started rolling in, and suddenly we could afford a real apartment, a 2-bedroom with a view of the city and a kitchen island I'd dreamed about for years. But success, as Uncle Raymond had warned me, does change people. Marcus started working later, traveling more, networking at events that somehow never included spouses. He bought expensive suits and a luxury watch, traded in his Honda for a BMW, and began talking about building his brand in the financial world. When I suggested we start trying for kids, he said we needed to wait until he was more established. The distance between us grew so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. It was like watching a plant die. You don't see it happening day by day, but one morning you wake up and realize something that was once alive is now just taking up space. I tried everything to bridge that gap. I planned romantic dinners that he missed because of client emergencies. I suggested weekend getaways that he postponed because of market volatility. I even considered leaving nursing to support his career full-time, thinking maybe if I could be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, he'd remember why he fell in love with me in the first place. The night everything fell apart, I had been planning a surprise for our 5th wedding anniversary. I'd convinced the hospital to give me a rare weekend off, made reservations at the restaurant where we'd had our wedding reception, and even bought a new dress, a red one that Marcus had once said was his favorite color on me. I was in our bedroom, getting ready, when I heard his key in the door. I remember feeling so excited, so sure that this night would be the turning point that brought us back to each other. I called out that I'd be ready in 5 minutes, that I had a surprise for him. His response still echoes in my head 13 years later. "Rebecca, we need to talk." I knew. In that moment, in the tone of his voice, in the way he didn't call me Becca like he always did, I knew my marriage was over. I sat on the edge of our bed in that red dress, still holding the earrings I'd been about to put on, and listened as the man I'd loved for 8 years explained why he couldn't love me anymore. He said he needed space to grow. He said we'd grown apart. He said he'd been offered an opportunity with a firm in Chicago, and he needed to take it, and it wasn't fair to ask me to uproot my life for his dreams. He said a lot of things that night, but what he didn't say was that he'd been seeing someone else for 6 months, his new boss's daughter, a woman named Clarissa who'd gone to private schools and summer camps and had never worked a day in her life. I found out about Clarissa 3 weeks later when a mutual friend saw their engagement announcement in the Chicago Tribune. Marcus left me with half our savings, about $12,000, and a pile of debt I didn't know we'd accumulated. Apparently, building his brand had been more expensive than I'd realized, and somehow my name was on several credit cards I'd never seen. The apartment we couldn't afford without his income. The car payments that were more than my monthly salary. I was 31 years old, and I felt like my life had been erased. But the worst part wasn't the money or the apartment or even the humiliation of explaining to everyone why my husband of 5 years had suddenly vanished. The worst part was the note he left on the kitchen counter. Not a letter, a note. 3 sentences on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad. "I can't do this anymore. You'll be better off without me holding you back. I'm sorry it had to end this way." No explanation. No acknowledgement of the 8 years we'd spent together. No recognition of the woman who'd worked double shifts to pay for his dreams. Just 3 sentences that reduced our entire relationship to an inconvenience he'd finally decided to discard. The months after Marcus left were the darkest of my life, but they were also when I discovered what I was really made of. I moved back into a studio apartment, not the same one, thank God, but similar enough to feel like a cosmic joke. This one was above a laundromat instead of an Indian restaurant, so at least it smelled like fabric softener instead of curry. I threw myself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. I picked up every extra shift available, worked holidays, covered for colleagues who needed time off. The other nurses started calling me the Iron Woman because I never seemed to break, never seemed to need rest. What they didn't see was how I spent my days off, curled up on my tiny couch, eating cereal for dinner, wondering how someone could promise to love you forever and then just leave. But Uncle Raymond saw through the facade. He started showing up at the hospital during my breaks, bringing coffee and homemade sandwiches that were somehow always exactly what I needed to eat even though I hadn't realized I was hungry. He never asked about Marcus directly, never pushed me to talk about what happened, but he had a way of being present that reminded me I wasn't as alone as I felt. During one of these impromptu visits, about 6 months after Marcus left, Uncle Raymond sat across from me in the hospital cafeteria and said something that changed my perspective completely. "You know, Rebecca, I've been watching you these past few months, and I've realized something. You've been treating this like a failure, but I think it might be the best thing that ever happened to you." I almost choked on my coffee. "Uncle Ray, my husband left me with debt, no home, and no explanation. How exactly is that the best thing that ever happened to me?" He leaned back in his chair, that familiar twinkle in his eyes that usually meant he was about to share some piece of wisdom disguised as rambling. "Because now you get to find out who Rebecca Martinez really is when she's not trying to be half of something else." He was right, though it took me months to understand what he meant. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. I paid off the debts Marcus had left behind, one minimum payment at a time. I started therapy with Dr. Patricia Huang, a warm, no-nonsense woman who helped me understand that being abandoned doesn't mean you're unworthy of love, it means you were in love with someone who wasn't capable of recognizing what they had. I went back to school part-time, finally pursuing that nurse practitioner degree I'd put on hold to support Marcus's career. It took me 4 years of night classes and weekend clinicals, but I graduated summa cum laude with a specialty in family medicine. The day I got my diploma, Uncle Raymond was in the front row, crying harder than I was. With my advanced degree, I was able to get a position at a community health clinic in an underserved part of the city, exactly what I'd dreamed of doing back when Marcus and I used to talk about changing the world. The work was challenging, emotionally demanding, and incredibly fulfilling. I was helping people who couldn't afford traditional healthcare, making a real difference in my community, and finally feeling like I was living a life that mattered. But perhaps most importantly, I learned to be alone without being lonely. I developed friendships with my colleagues, especially Dr. Sarah Chen, a fellow nurse practitioner who became like the sister I'd never had. I took up hiking on weekends, started reading again, learned to cook something other than microwave dinners. I even tried dating a few times, though nothing serious ever developed. I told myself I was being cautious, but the truth was that Marcus had left me with trust issues I wasn't sure I'd ever fully overcome. Years passed. 5 became 7, 7 became 10. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had married Clarissa and moved to Los Angeles, where he'd started his own investment firm. They had 2 children and lived in Malibu. Sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he ever regretted the way he'd ended things, but mostly I was grateful for the life I'd built without him. Uncle Raymond remained a constant presence throughout this entire period. As the years went on, his various business ventures made him increasingly wealthy, though you'd never know it from the way he lived. He still drove the same beat-up pickup truck he'd had for 15 years, still wore flannel shirts and jeans with holes in them, still lived in that cluttered house filled with half-finished inventions. But I started noticing changes in him around my 40th birthday. He was forgetting things, small things at first, like where he'd put his keys or what day of the week it was. Then bigger things, like appointments we'd made or conversations we'd had the week before. When I suggested he see a doctor, he brushed off my concerns with his typical humor, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in October, early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Uncle Raymond was 68 years old, and the doctor estimated he had maybe 5 to 7 good years left before the disease progressed significantly. That night, I sat with him on his front porch while he processed the news, both of us staring out at the city lights below. "I'm scared, Rebecca," he said quietly, and it was the first time I'd ever heard him admit fear about anything. "Not of dying, I've made my peace with that. But of forgetting. Of losing myself before I'm gone." I took his hand, this man who had been more of a father to me than anyone else in my adult life. "Then we'll make sure the time you have left counts. We'll make sure you know how much you're loved." Over the next 3 years, Uncle Raymond and I grew even closer. I spent most of my free time with him, helping him organize his affairs, listening to him tell stories about his life, his business ventures, his regrets and triumphs. He was still sharp most days, still the brilliant, eccentric man I'd always known, but the good days were becoming less frequent. During one of our conversations, He brought up something that surprised me. Rebecca, I want you to know that I've been watching how you've handled everything life has thrown at you. The way you rebuilt after Marcus left, the way you've dedicated yourself to helping others, the way you've taken care of me these past few years without ever making it feel like a burden. You've become exactly the woman I always knew you could be. I felt tears prick my eyes. Uncle Ray, you don't need to. Yes, I do, he interrupted gently. Because I want you to know that everything I've built, everything I've accumulated, it's all for you. You're the only family I have left, and you're the only person I trust to carry on what I've started. At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. Uncle Raymond had always been generous, always quick to help when I needed it, but I had no idea about the true extent of his wealth. I knew his various businesses were successful, but he lived so modestly that I assumed he was comfortable, not what he actually was. I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed him to be more specific about his affairs and his legacy. But I was so focused on treasuring the time we had left, on making sure he felt loved and cared for, that I didn't think about the practical implications of what he was telling me. The last good conversation we had was about Marcus. It was a Sunday afternoon in late spring, and we were sitting in his garden, watching the roses he'd been tending for decades bloom in the warm sun. Out of nowhere, he asked if I'd ever wondered what would have happened if Marcus had stayed. Sometimes, I admitted. But mostly I'm grateful he left. I think I needed to learn who I was on my own. Uncle Raymond nodded thoughtfully. You know, I never told you this, but I never trusted him. There was something about the way he looked at you, like you were a stepping stone instead of a destination. I'm glad you found out who he really was before you wasted more years on him. Do you think I'll ever find someone who sees me as a destination? I asked. He smiled, that warm, knowing smile that had comforted me through so many difficult moments. Honey, someone who deserves you will see you as both the journey and the destination. Don't settle for anything less. 3 weeks later, Uncle Raymond had a stroke while working in his garden. He was rushed to the hospital where I worked, and I was there when the doctors told me the damage was extensive. He lived for 2 more days, drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally squeezing my hand to let me know he could hear me. In one of his last moments of clarity, he looked at me and whispered, "Remember what I taught you about success, Rebecca. It's not about what you gain, it's about what you become. And you've become something beautiful." He died that evening with me holding his hand, and I felt like I'd lost the last person in the world who truly understood me. Uncle Raymond's funeral was held on a Thursday morning in June at the small chapel where I'd been married 13 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. This place had witnessed both one of my happiest moments and one of my saddest. But whereas my wedding day had been filled with hope for an uncertain future, Uncle Raymond's service felt like a celebration of a life fully lived and deeply meaningful. I was surprised by how many people attended. Uncle Raymond had seemed like such a solitary figure, but the chapel was packed with people whose lives he'd touched. Former employees from his various companies, neighbors he'd helped over the years, even some patients from the community clinic who had benefited from his anonymous donations I hadn't known he was making. Dr. Chen sat beside me throughout the service, occasionally squeezing my hand when the grief threatened to overwhelm me. During the eulogy, I shared stories about Uncle Raymond's kindness, his brilliance, his ridiculous sense of humor. I talked about how he'd been the one constant in my life after my parents died, how he'd seen me through my darkest moments, how he taught me that success wasn't measured by what you accumulated but by how you treated the people who mattered most. After the service, as people filed out offering their condolences, a well-dressed man in his 50s approached me. He had graying hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling delicate situations. "Ms. Martinez," he said, extending his hand, "I'm Jonathan Whitmore. I was your uncle's attorney. I'm very sorry for your loss. Raymond spoke of you often and with great affection." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the genuine warmth in his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Uncle Ray mentioned you a few times over the years. I wonder if we might schedule a time to meet," he said carefully. "There are some matters regarding your uncle's estate that we need to discuss." Would sometime next week be convenient? Estate matters. I nodded, assuming this was about Uncle Raymond's house, maybe some financial accounts that needed to be settled. I'd been dreading dealing with his belongings, sorting through decades of accumulated inventions and memories, but I knew it had to be done. Of course, I said. Would Tuesday morning work? I can come to your office before my shift at the clinic. Mr. Whitmore hesitated for just a moment. Actually, if it's all right with you, I prefer to meet at Raymond's house. There are quite a few documents to review, and it might be easier to handle everything there. Something in his tone made me pause, but I attributed it to the natural gravity that surrounds discussions of death and inheritance. That's fine. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, he said. And perhaps, well, you might want to clear your schedule for the afternoon as well. This could take some time. The days between Uncle Raymond's funeral and the meeting with Mr. Whitmore passed in a strange blur. I went through the motions of normal life, work, sleep, meals, but everything felt muted, like I was experiencing it through a thick fog. The community clinic felt different without the knowledge that Uncle Raymond was somewhere in the world, probably tinkering with some impossible invention or reading about quantum physics for fun. Dr. Chen convinced me to take a few days off, concerned about how the grief was affecting me. You've been everyone else's rock for so long, she said during one of our conversations in the break room. Let yourself be human for a while. Let yourself grieve. But grieving felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. There was so much to do, so many practical matters to handle. I'd spent the weekend going through Uncle Raymond's house, trying to make sense of his filing system, which seemed to exist in some dimension beyond normal organizational logic. Bills were mixed with business documents, which were scattered among scientific journals and handwritten notes about projects I couldn't begin to understand. The house itself felt impossibly empty without his presence. Every room held memories. The kitchen where he taught me to make his famous pancakes, the living room where we'd watched old movies on rainy Sundays, the study where he'd helped me with my homework during high school. I found myself talking to him as I moved through the rooms, updating him on what I was discovering, asking his advice about what to do with his collections of gadgets and books. Tuesday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed appropriate for discussing dead people's business. I drove to Uncle Raymond's house with a strange mixture of dread and relief. Dread about finalizing this chapter of my life, relief that I'd soon have answers about what needed to be done. Mr. Whitmore was already there when I arrived, his black sedan parked in the driveway next to Uncle Raymond's beat-up pickup truck, which I still couldn't bring myself to move. He greeted me at the front door with that same kind but professional demeanor, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. "Thank you for meeting me here," he said as we walked into Uncle Raymond's cluttered living room. "I know this must be difficult." I cleared a space on the couch, moving aside a stack of magazines about renewable energy and a half-finished crossword puzzle that would never be completed. "It is, but it needs to be done. I appreciate you handling all the legal aspects." Mr. Whitmore set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to know that your uncle was very specific about his wishes. Everything we're about to discuss was planned carefully over the past 5 years, updated regularly, and reflects his deep love and respect for you." I felt tears threaten again. He was always so thoughtful about everything. "Yes," Mr. Whitmore agreed, pulling out a thick manila folder. "He was also, as you probably know, far more successful than he let on." I nodded. I knew his businesses were doing well, but he lived so simply. I honestly never thought much about the details. Mr. Whitmore paused, his hands resting on the folder. "Rebecca, may I call you Rebecca? I need to prepare you for what we're about to discuss. Your uncle's estate is substantial. More substantial than I think you realize." Something in his tone made my stomach flutter with anxiety. "What do you mean by substantial?" He opened the folder and pulled out a document that looked like it had been prepared by a team of lawyers. Raymond's total estate, including all business holdings, real estate, investments, and liquid assets, is valued at approximately $4 to $7 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt dizzy, like the room was tilting around me. I'm sorry, what? $47 million, Mr. Whitmore repeated gently. And according to his will, which was updated just 6 months ago, you are the sole beneficiary of everything. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Numbers that large felt abstract, impossible. That can't be right. Uncle Raymond lived in this house, drove that old truck. He wore clothes with holes in them. Mr. Whitmore smiled sadly. Raymond was many things, but materialistic wasn't one of them. He believed money was a tool, not a goal. Most of his wealth came from selling his various companies over the years and investing the proceeds very wisely. He also owned several properties that have appreciated significantly, including this house, which sits on 12 acres of land that's now worth about $8 million on its own. My head was spinning. I don't understand. Why didn't he ever tell me? He wanted to, but he also wanted to make sure you became the person you were meant to be without the influence of knowing you'd inherit wealth. He was very proud of how you rebuilt your life after your divorce, how you dedicated yourself to helping others. He felt that knowing about the inheritance might have changed your choices. I thought about all the times Uncle Raymond had helped me over the years, the care packages during nursing school, the birthday money that was always exactly what I needed, the way he'd been there for me after Marcus left. He'd been supporting me all along, but he'd done it in a way that let me maintain my independence and self-respect. There's more, Mr. Whitmore continued, pulling out additional documents. In addition to the monetary inheritance, you're also inheriting this house and all its contents, a vacation home in Colorado, and several investment properties. There's also a trust that's been set up to continue funding the community health clinic where you work. Raymond was very proud of your work there. I felt overwhelmed by gratitude and grief in equal measure. Even in death, Uncle Raymond was taking care of me, making sure I could continue the work that mattered to me without worrying about funding. When does all this? I mean, how does this work? I asked, feeling completely out of my depth. The will needs to be probated, which typically takes a few months, but Raymond set up most of his assets in trusts to avoid complications. You should have access to the majority of your inheritance within 60 days. Mr. Whitmore handed me a business card. I'd recommend you consider hiring a financial advisor to help you manage everything. This level of wealth requires careful planning. Financial advisor. The words brought an unwelcome image of Marcus to my mind, and I pushed it away quickly. That was my past. This, whatever this was my future. There is one more thing, Mr. Whitmore said, reaching into his briefcase again. Raymond left this for you to read in private. He handed me an envelope with my name written on it in Uncle Raymond's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I took it. I'll leave you alone to read it, Mr. Whitmore said, standing up. Take all the time you need. When you're ready, we can discuss the next steps. After he left, I sat in Uncle Raymond's living room, surrounded by his books and inventions and memories, holding the last letter he would ever write to me. Outside, the rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. I opened the envelope and began to read his final words to me. Asterisk, my dearest Rebecca, asterisk. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've just learned something that probably feels impossible to believe. I know you're sitting in my living room right now, probably looking around at all my junk and wondering how any of this makes sense. Trust me, it makes perfect sense. You just need to see it from my perspective. Asterisk. Asterisk first, I want you to know that every dollar of this inheritance is yours by right, not by charity. You've earned it through the kind of person you've become, the way you've lived your life, the love and care you've shown me over the years. Money is just energy, Rebecca. It flows to where it's needed most, and right now, it needs to flow to you. Asterisk. Asterisk, I've been planning this for years, watching you grow from that heartbroken young woman who moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat into the incredible woman you are today. You think you rebuilt your life after Marcus left, but the truth is, you built a completely new life. You became who you were always meant to be. And that person deserves every opportunity to change the world. Asterisk. Asterisk, I have some specific wishes for how you use this inheritance, but they're suggestions, not requirements. I want you to expand the community clinic, maybe open additional locations in other underserved areas. I want you to set up scholarships for nursing students who come from backgrounds like yours, kids who have the heart to help others but need financial support to make it happen. And I want you to buy yourself something beautiful and unnecessary, something that brings you joy for no other reason than that you deserve joy. Asterisk. Asterisk, most importantly, I want you to remember that money doesn't change who you are, it amplifies who you are. You're generous, compassionate, and strong. Now you have the resources to be those things on a scale that can impact thousands of lives. Asterisk. Asterisk, there's one more thing I need to tell you, and it's going to sound crazy, but hear me out. I have a feeling that inheriting this money is going to bring some people from your past back into your life. People who might not have been interested in Rebecca the nurse practitioner but will suddenly find themselves very interested in Rebecca the millionaire. If that happens, and my gut tells me it will, I want you to remember something. Anyone who shows up in your life because of money is showing up for the wrong reasons. Asterisk. Asterisk, you are not a prize to be won or a resource to be exploited. You are a complete, whole, valuable human being who happens to have inherited some money. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise, especially anyone from your past who couldn't see your worth when you had less. Asterisk. Asterisk, be wise, my darling girl. Be generous. Be happy. And remember that your old uncle loves you more than you'll ever know. Asterisk. Asterisk, all my love. Asterisk. Asterisk, Uncle Raymond. Asterisk. Asterisk, P.S. Check behind the books on quantum physics in my study. There's something there I've been saving for the right moment. Asterisk. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Uncle Raymond had known me better than I'd known myself. He'd seen this coming. The way my life would change, the challenges I'd face, even the possibility that people from my past might suddenly reappear. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and walked to his study, a room I'd always found slightly intimidating because of the sheer volume of technical books and scientific journals he kept there. The quantum physics section took up an entire shelf, and when I pulled the books forward, I found a small wooden box hidden behind them. Inside the box was another envelope and a jewelry case. The envelope contained the deed to a piece of property I'd never heard of, a small cabin on a lake about 2 hours north of the city, described as a place where Rebecca can go when the world gets too noisy. The jewelry case held my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one I'd admired as a child but thought had been lost when my parents died. I sat there in Uncle Raymond's study, wearing my grandmother's pearls and holding the deed to a lake house I'd never seen, trying to wrap my mind around the fact that my life had just changed in ways I couldn't even comprehend. Mr. Whitmore returned an hour later to find me still sitting on the floor surrounded by Uncle Raymond's books. He took one look at my face and smiled knowingly. He had a way of surprising people, didn't he? That's an understatement, I said, carefully placing the pearls back in their case. Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, how do you know Uncle Raymond's prediction about people from my past showing up? Did he tell you something specific? The attorney settled into Uncle Raymond's desk chair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. Not specifically, no. But Raymond was very astute about human nature. He'd seen how wealth affects relationships, both his own and others. He asked me to be prepared for complications. What kind of complications? People who might come forward claiming they have a right to part of the inheritance. Distant relatives, former business partners, anyone who might think they deserve a piece of what Raymond built. He paused, studying my face. He was particularly concerned about your ex-husband. The mention of Marcus sent a chill through me. He never even met Uncle Raymond more than a few times. How could he have any claim? Legally, he couldn't. You were divorced years ago, and Raymond's will is very clear. But that doesn't mean he won't try. Mr. Whitmore leaned forward. Raymond gave me very specific instructions about what to do if Marcus Thompson ever contacted me or showed up claiming any interest in the estate. Which were? To schedule a formal reading of the will. Raymond felt that if Marcus was going to insert himself into this situation, he deserved to understand exactly what he walked away from when he left you. I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of me never wanted to see Marcus again, but another part, the part that had spent 13 years wondering if he ever regretted his choices, was curious about what Uncle Raymond had planned. "Do you think he'll actually show up?" I asked. "I don't know," Mr. Whitmore admitted. But Raymond seemed to think he would. He said something about people like Marcus having an uncanny ability to sense when they've missed an opportunity. 3 days later, I got my answer. I was at work, treating a 7-year-old boy with an ear infection, when Dr. Chen knocked on the examination room door. Her expression was strange, concerned but also angry in a way I rarely saw from her. "Rebecca, there's someone here to see you. He says he's your ex-husband." My blood turned to ice. "Marcus is here. He's in the waiting room. Should I tell him you're busy?" I looked down at my young patient, who was staring up at me with wide, trusting eyes. This little boy needed my full attention, not whatever emotional chaos Marcus was about to unleash in my life. "Tell him I'll be out in 10 minutes, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "And Sarah, thank you for running interference." She squeezed my shoulder. "Of course. Take your time." I finished treating my patient, spent a few extra minutes reassuring his worried mother about the ear infection, and walked them to the checkout desk. All the while, my mind was racing. Why was Marcus here? How had he found out about Uncle Raymond's death? And more importantly, what did he want? I found him sitting in the corner of our modest waiting room, looking completely out of place among the families seeking basic healthcare. He was wearing an expensive suit, navy blue, perfectly tailored, and shoes that probably cost more than most of our patients made in a month. His hair was still thick and dark, though I could see traces of gray at the temples, and he'd maintained the athletic build that had first attracted me 20 years ago. But it was his expression that stopped me cold. He was looking around the clinic with barely concealed disdain, his mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. This was the face of a man who had clearly moved far beyond the world of community healthcare, and he wasn't bothering to hide his judgment. When he saw me, though, his expression shifted immediately. The practiced smile I remembered so well spread across his face, the one that had once made me feel like the most important person in the world and now just made me feel manipulated. "Becca," he said, standing up and moving toward me with arms slightly outstretched, as if he expected a hug. I took a step back and crossed my arms. "It's Rebecca. What are you doing here, Marcus?" His smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "I heard about your uncle. I'm so sorry for your loss. I know how much he meant to you." The casual way he said it, like we were old friends catching up instead of a woman facing the man who had abandoned her 13 years ago, made anger rise in my chest. "How did you even know about Uncle Raymond's death?" "Word travels fast in certain circles," he said vaguely. "Can we talk privately? Maybe grab coffee somewhere?" I looked around the waiting room, acutely aware that several of my colleagues and patients were watching this interaction with curiosity. The last thing I wanted was to make a scene at work. 5 minutes, I said curtly. "There's a break room down the hall." I led him to the small space where the staff ate lunch and held informal meetings. It felt surreal to be in this room, a place that represented everything I'd built for myself, with the person who represented everything I'd lost and overcome. Marcus settled into one of the plastic chairs and looked around with that same expression of barely masked distaste. "So this is where you work now. It's very charitable of you." The condescension in his voice was like a slap. "I'm a nurse practitioner, Marcus. I help people who can't afford traditional healthcare. It's called having a purpose." Of course, he said quickly, obviously realizing he'd struck the wrong tone. "I didn't mean to sound. I think it's wonderful that you found something you're passionate about." I remained standing, arms crossed, waiting for him to get to the point. "Rebecca, I came here because I've been doing some thinking lately. About us. About how things ended. About the mistakes I made." He looked up at me with what I'm sure he thought was a vulnerable expression. I was young and stupid and scared, and I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. I stared at him in disbelief. Are you seriously giving me an apology speech right now? 13 years later. I know the timing seems strange. The timing seems calculated, I interrupted. You disappear for over a decade, and now, 3 days after Uncle Raymond's funeral, you show up at my workplace wanting to discuss mistakes? What do you really want, Marcus? He shifted in his chair, and for the first time, I saw a flash of the calculating look I remembered from our last years together. I want to talk about us. About the possibility of reconnecting. Reconnecting. I said the word like it tasted bitter. What happened to Clarissa? His face darkened. That didn't work out. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, though I wasn't sorry at all. But that doesn't mean there's an us to reconnect to. You made sure of that when you left me a note and disappeared. Rebecca, please. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorrier than you can imagine. But we were so good together. We understood each other. We had dreams, plans. We had dreams, I corrected. You had plans. And those plans didn't include me. He stood up abruptly, moving closer to me. I could smell his cologne, expensive, unfamiliar. Everything about him was expensive and unfamiliar now. That's not true. You were always part of my plans. I got confused about what I wanted. But I've had years to think about it, and I know now that what I want is you. The sheer audacity of his words left me speechless for a moment. Then I started laughing, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. You know what you want is me, I repeated. After 13 years of zero contact, you know what you want is me. That's fascinating, Marcus, because I actually know what I want, and it's for you to leave. His jaw tightened. Rebecca, be reasonable. We have history together. We were married for 5 years. That has to count for something. It does count for something. It counts as a lesson learned. I moved toward the door, ready to end this conversation, but his next words stopped me cold. I know about your inheritance. I turned around slowly. Excuse me. Your uncle's will. The money he left you. I know about it. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. And how exactly do you know about that? He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. I have connections in the legal community. Word gets around when someone inherits that kind of money. That kind of money, I repeated. So this isn't about reconnecting or apologizing or realizing you made a mistake. This is about money. It's not just about money. Get out. My voice was deadly quiet. Get out of my workplace, get out of my life, and if you ever contact me again, I'll call the police. Rebecca, wait. Get out. He left, but not before giving me one more of those practice smiles. This isn't over, Becca. We belong together, and deep down, you know it. After he was gone, I sat in the break room for a long time, my hands shaking with rage and something else, a feeling I couldn't quite identify at first. Then I realized what it was: vindication. Uncle Raymond had been right. Marcus had shown up, just like he predicted, drawn by the scent of money like a vulture to carrion. But knowing Uncle Raymond had seen this coming didn't make it any less painful. The man I'd once loved enough to marry had just revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person I'd hoped he wasn't. Dr. Chen found me there 20 minutes later. Are you okay? That looked intense. He wants to reconnect, I said, making air quotes around the word. Apparently, he's been thinking about his mistakes. Sarah sat down across from me. And this sudden realization has nothing to do with your inheritance. Oh, it has everything to do with my inheritance. He made that very clear. What are you going to do? I thought about Uncle Raymond's letter, about his warning, about the specific instructions he'd given Mr. Whitmore. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants. Sarah looked confused. Which is? I smiled for the first time since Marcus had walked into the clinic. A chance to understand exactly what he walked away from. That evening, I called Mr. Whitmore and told him about Marcus's unexpected visit. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke. I have to admit, Raymond's timing predictions continue to amaze me. He said Marcus would show up within a week of you learning about the inheritance. It's been exactly 4 days. He wants to reconnect, I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Apparently, losing his second wife has made him realize what a mistake he made letting me go. I see. And what would you like me to do about this situation? I thought about Uncle Raymond's instructions, about the formal will reading he'd planned for exactly this scenario. I want to follow Uncle Raymond's wishes. Set up the formal reading. Let Marcus see exactly what he walked away from. Are you sure, Rebecca? This could be emotionally difficult for you. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about the rage I'd felt in the break room, the way Marcus had looked at my clinic with disdain, the casual entitlement in his voice when he'd said we belonged together. I'm sure. Uncle Raymond planned this for a reason. I trust his judgment. All right then. I'll contact Mr. Thompson and schedule a formal reading of the will for Monday morning. Should I tell him you'll be there? Absolutely. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The weekend passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety. I spent Saturday cleaning Uncle Raymond's house, trying to keep busy while my mind churned through possible scenarios for Monday's meeting. What would Marcus say when he heard the full extent of the inheritance? How would he react to Uncle Raymond's specific bequests? And most importantly, what was Uncle Raymond's ultimate plan? Sunday evening, Dr. Chen came over with Chinese takeout and wine, sensing that I needed the company. Are you nervous about tomorrow? She asked as we sat on Uncle Raymond's front porch, watching the sun set over the city. Nervous isn't the right word, I said, sipping my wine. I feel like I'm about to watch a play unfold, and I already know how it ends, but I'm curious to see how the actors perform. That's a very detached way to look at it. Maybe. But Marcus made his choice 13 years ago. Tomorrow isn't about giving him a second chance, it's about showing him the consequences of the choice he already made. Sarah studied my face in the fading light. You've changed since Uncle Raymond died. There's something different about you. She was right. I could feel it too, a new kind of confidence, a clarity I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about survival or stability or proving myself. I was free to make choices based purely on what I believed was right. Uncle Raymond told me once that money doesn't change who you are, it amplifies who you are. I think I'm just finally becoming who I was always meant to be. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, one of those perfect autumn days that make you grateful to be alive. I dressed carefully for the occasion, not to impress Marcus, but to honor Uncle Raymond's memory. I wore a navy blue dress that was professional but not severe, paired with my grandmother's pearls. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful, confident woman who had built a meaningful life. Mr. Whitmore's office was in one of the older buildings downtown, the kind with marble floors and carved wooden panels that spoke of established respectability. His secretary, a silver-haired woman named Margaret, greeted me warmly and offered coffee while we waited for Marcus to arrive. Mr. Whitmore has told me so much about your uncle, she said as she poured coffee from an elegant silver service. He sounds like he was an extraordinary man. He was, I agreed. He had a way of seeing people's potential and helping them reach it, often without them realizing what he was doing. Margaret smiled. That's a rare gift. At exactly 10 o'clock, Marcus arrived. He dressed for the occasion too, a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired with a tie that screamed wealth and sophistication. But I could see the calculation in his eyes as he took in the elegant surroundings, clearly assessing the financial implications of being in such an upscale law office. Rebecca, he said, moving toward me with that same expectant smile. You look beautiful. I remained seated and nodded politely. Marcus. Mr. Whitmore emerged from his office, impeccably dressed and carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it contained weighty matters. Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming. Shall we begin? His conference room was intimidating in the way that expensive legal spaces are meant to be. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs, walls lined with law books that looked like they'd been bound by hand. Marcus settled into the chair across from me, and I could see him trying to read my expression, looking for some sign of the vulnerable woman he'd once known. Mr. Whitmore sat at the head of the table and opened his portfolio with ceremonial precision. We're here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Raymond Martinez, dated March 15th of this year. Mr. Thompson, I understand you've expressed interest in the disposition of Mr. Martinez's estate. Marcus straightened in his chair. I have. Rebecca and I were married for 5 years, and during that time, I developed a close relationship with her uncle. I believe he would have wanted me to be involved in taking care of Rebecca during this difficult time. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Marcus had barely tolerated Uncle Raymond when we were married, and the idea that they'd had a close relationship was so absurd it was almost insulting. Mr. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but I caught the slightest flicker of amusement in his eyes. I see. And you believe this relationship entitles you to some consideration in the inheritance. I believe Raymond would have wanted Rebecca to have support during this transition. Inheriting money can be overwhelming, especially for someone who's never dealt with significant wealth before. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. He was sitting there, in front of Uncle Raymond's lawyer, suggesting that I was too inexperienced and naive to handle my own inheritance. The Marcus I'd married had been ambitious and sometimes selfish, but he'd never been this openly dismissive of my capabilities. I appreciate your concern for Ms. Martinez, Mr. Whitmore said smoothly. Let me begin by reading the relevant portions of Mr. Martinez's will, so we're all clear on his wishes. He pulled out a thick document and began to read in his measured, professional voice. I, Raymond Martinez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all real property, financial assets, business interests, and personal belongings, to my beloved niece, Rebecca Martinez, who has been the light of my life and the daughter I never had. Marcus's face remained impassive, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. Mr. Whitmore continued. Specifically, this includes the family home at 1247 Hillcrest Drive, valued at approximately $8 million, the vacation property in Aspen, Colorado, valued at approximately $2 million, various investment properties totaling approximately $12 million in value, business interests and stock holdings valued at approximately $20 million, and liquid assets totaling approximately $5 million. I watched Marcus's face as the numbers accumulated. His practiced composure was beginning to crack, and I could see the calculations spinning behind his eyes. The total estate, Mr. Whitmore concluded, is valued at approximately $4 to $7 million, all of which is bequeathed solely to Rebecca Martinez. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus stared at Mr. Whitmore as if he hadn't heard correctly. $47 million, he said finally. Approximately, yes. The exact figure will depend on current market valuations, but that's our best estimate. Marcus turned to look at me, and for the first time since he'd walked back into my life, I saw genuine emotion in his face, shock, regret, and something that looked like panic. Rebecca, he said, his voice softer than it had been since he'd returned. I had no idea. When you said your uncle was successful, I never imagined. No, I said quietly, you never imagined much about Uncle Raymond at all. But there's more, isn't there, Mr. Whitmore? The lawyer nodded and reached into his portfolio again. There is indeed. Mr. Martinez was very specific about certain scenarios he anticipated might arise after his death. He pulled out another document, this one sealed in a separate envelope. Mr. Martinez left specific instructions to be read in the event that Marcus Thompson ever contacted me or attempted to claim any interest in the estate. Marcus went very still. What kind of instructions? Mr. Whitmore broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. This is a letter addressed to Marcus Thompson, to be read aloud in his presence should the circumstances warrant it. He cleared his throat and began to read in Uncle Raymond's words, though spoken in the lawyer's measured cadence. Marcus, if you're hearing this, it means you've done exactly what I expected you to do. shown up in Rebecca's life the moment you learned she inherited money. I want you to understand something very clearly. Rebecca became a millionaire the day she decided she was better off without you. Marcus's face had gone pale, but Mr. Whitmore continued reading. For 13 years, she's built a life of purpose and meaning. She's helped hundreds of families access healthcare they couldn't afford. She's earned an advanced degree and become a leader in her community. She's shown kindness to a dying old man and dignity in the face of your abandonment. The money I'm leaving her isn't a windfall, it's recognition of what she's already accomplished. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I kept them focused on Marcus's face as Uncle Raymond's words continued to unfold. You, on the other hand, have spent those same 13 years building wealth while apparently learning nothing about character. The fact that you're sitting in that lawyer's office right now, 13 years after walking away from the best woman you'll ever know, proves that success taught you nothing about what actually matters. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing red. So here's what I want you to understand. Rebecca owes you nothing. Not an explanation, not a second chance, and certainly not a share of what I've left her. You had your chance to be part of something meaningful, and you chose to walk away. The only thing you're entitled to now is the knowledge of what you gave up. Mr. Whitmore looked up from the letter. The letter is signed and dated, and there's one final instruction. He reached into his portfolio one more time and pulled out a cashier's check. Mr. Martinez instructed me to give this to Marcus Thompson if he ever showed up claiming interest in the estate. He slid the check across the table. Marcus looked down at it, and I saw his face go through a series of expressions: confusion, hope, and then humiliation. It's a check for $3, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Mr. Whitmore confirmed. Mr. Martinez's note indicates that this represents the exact value of your contribution to Rebecca's life, $1 for each sentence in the note you left when you abandoned her. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Marcus stared down at the check, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't begin to catalogue. Finally, he looked up at me. Rebecca, Don't, I said softly. Just don't. He stood up slowly, leaving the check on the table. This isn't how I wanted this to go. No, I agreed. I imagine you wanted it to go very differently. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, the recognition that he had made a mistake so profound it could never be undone. For what it's worth, he said, I really did love you. Once. I know you did, I replied. But love isn't enough when it comes with conditions. After Marcus left, Mr. Whitmore and I sat in silence for a few minutes. Finally, he spoke. Your uncle was quite the strategist. He was quite a lot of things. I picked up the check Marcus had left behind. What should I do with this? Mr. Whitmore smiled. Whatever you think Raymond would have wanted you to do with it. I thought about Uncle Raymond's sense of humor, his belief in justice, his understanding of human nature. Then I folded the check and put it in my purse. I think I know exactly what to do with it. The week following the will reading passed in a strange combination of relief and surreal adjustment. Marcus didn't contact me again, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd returned to Los Angeles almost immediately. Part of me felt vindicated by Uncle Raymond's perfectly orchestrated revelation, but another part felt unexpectedly melancholy about the final closing of that chapter of my life. I spent those days making practical arrangements for my new reality. Mr. Whitmore introduced me to Patricia Henley, a financial advisor who specialized in sudden wealth syndrome, apparently a real condition affecting people who inherit or otherwise acquire large sums of money unexpectedly. Patricia was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had the rare ability to discuss millions of dollars as casually as most people talked about grocery shopping. The first thing we need to address, she said during our initial meeting, is your emotional relationship with this money. Many people in your situation feel guilty about inheriting wealth they didn't earn, or overwhelmed by the responsibility that comes with it. I thought about Uncle Raymond's letter, his belief that I'd earned every dollar through the person I'd become. I don't feel guilty, I said slowly. But I do feel responsible. Like I need to make sure this money does something meaningful. Patricia smiled. That's a healthy perspective. Now, let's talk about practical matters. Over the next several days, she helped me understand the magnitude of what I'd inherited. The $47 million was just the beginning. Uncle Raymond's various business investments were continuing to generate income, and several of his patents were still producing royalties. If I was careful, I'd never have to work again, and neither would my children or their children. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. What do most people do in my situation? I asked during one of our sessions. It varies dramatically, Patricia said. Some people quit their jobs immediately and travel the world. Others become paralyzed by the choices and barely touch the money at all. A few, like you seem to be inclined to do, use it as a platform to amplify their existing values and goals. That last option resonated with me deeply. I didn't want to stop working. The community clinic was too important, and I'd worked too hard to become a nurse practitioner to walk away from it now. But I could expand it, maybe open additional locations, provide services I'd only dreamed of offering before. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the will reading, I was in my office at the clinic reviewing patient files when Dr. Chen knocked on my door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, but her expression was different from the day Marcus had shown up. This time, she looked curious rather than concerned. "Please tell me it's not another blast from my past," I said. Sarah laughed. "No, it's actually someone new. A woman. She says she knew your uncle and has something she needs to give you." I found the woman waiting in our small lobby, and I could immediately tell she didn't belong to our usual demographic. She was elegantly dressed in a way that suggested money but not ostentation, a beautifully cut black coat, understated jewelry, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about basic necessities. She appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair styled in a sophisticated bob and kind eyes behind designer glasses. When she saw me, she stood with the grace of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms and charity galas. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Catherine Blackwell. I was a friend of your uncle's, and I have something that belongs to you." We shook hands, and I noted her firm grip and the way she looked directly at me when she spoke, hallmarks of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Would you like to talk privately?" I asked, gesturing toward the break room. "That would be wonderful, thank you." Once we were settled with coffee, Catherine pulled a manila envelope from her purse and placed it on the table between us. "Raymond gave me this about 6 months ago, with specific instructions to bring it to you exactly 2 weeks after his funeral. He was very precise about the timing." I stared at the envelope, which had my name written on it in Uncle Raymond's familiar handwriting. "He planned for this meeting." Catherine smiled. "Your uncle planned for everything. He was one of the most thoughtful people I've ever known, and also one of the most strategic. He understood people better than most psychologists." "How did you know him?" I asked, curious about this elegant woman who seemed to inhabit a completely different world from Uncle Raymond's eccentric, solitary existence. "We were business partners for about 15 years. Raymond was the visionary behind several companies I helped fund and develop. He was also one of my dearest friends." Her expression grew wistful. "He talked about you constantly. He was so proud of the woman you'd become." I felt the familiar prick of tears that came whenever someone spoke about Uncle Raymond in the past tense. He was everything to me after my parents died. I don't know what I would have done without him. He knew that. And he also knew that inheriting his money was going to complicate your life in ways you haven't even begun to anticipate. She gestured to the envelope. "That's what this is about. Go ahead, open it." Inside the envelope was another letter from Uncle Raymond, along with what appeared to be legal documents and a business card. Asterisk, "My dearest Rebecca, asterisk." Asterisk, if Catherine is sitting across from you reading this, it means 2 weeks have passed since my funeral, and you've had time to process the initial shock of your inheritance. It also means that Marcus showed up exactly like I predicted he would, and you've had your first taste of how money changes the way people see you. Asterisk. Asterisk, now comes the harder part, figuring out what to do with the rest of your life. Asterisk. I've enclosed some documents that I hope will help. Catherine and I have been working on a project for the past 2 years, a foundation focused on expanding healthcare access in underserved communities. I've been funding it quietly, but I always intended for you to take it over eventually. The foundation currently has assets of $8 million and is already operating 3 community clinics in different states. The legal documents will transfer control of the foundation to you, making you the director and primary decision-maker for how it grows. This isn't charity, Rebecca. This is a job, probably the most important job you'll ever have. The foundation is set up to eventually operate dozens of clinics, provide scholarships for healthcare workers from underserved backgrounds, and research innovative ways to deliver medical care to people who can't afford it. Catherine has agreed to serve as your advisor and mentor as you learn to navigate this world. She's forgotten more about running foundations than most people ever learn, and she's someone you can trust completely. I know you're probably feeling overwhelmed by choices right now. Let this be your first choice. Say yes to something bigger than you ever imagined for yourself. All my love. Uncle Raymond. I looked up at Catherine, who was watching me with an expression of patient anticipation. A foundation, I said. He never mentioned any of this to me. Raymond was very careful about timing. He wanted you to become the person you needed to be before he introduced you to opportunities that might have overwhelmed you earlier. Catherine leaned forward. The foundation is real, Rebecca. It's been operating successfully for 2 years, and it's already making a meaningful impact. But it needs someone who understands healthcare from the ground up, someone who's actually worked in community medicine. I thought about my years at the clinic, the families I'd helped, the systemic problems I'd observed that could be addressed with adequate resources. The idea of expanding that work on a national scale was both thrilling and terrifying. What would this actually involve? I asked. Catherine smiled. Everything you're already doing, but bigger. We'd start by expanding the existing clinics, then opening new ones in other underserved areas. You'd work with local healthcare providers to identify the greatest needs, develop programs to address them, and oversee the implementation. She pulled out a tablet and showed me photographs of the 3 existing clinics. They looked remarkably similar to the one where I worked. Modest facilities that prioritized function over aesthetics, staffed by dedicated professionals who cared more about impact than profit. This clinic in rural Kentucky has reduced emergency room visits in its community by 30%, she said, swiping to the next image. This one in inner-city Detroit has become the primary healthcare provider for over 5,000 residents. And this one in rural New Mexico has implemented a mobile unit that serves migrant farm workers. I stared at the images, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a calling that aligned perfectly with everything I'd worked toward since becoming a nurse. I would still be able to practice medicine. I asked. Absolutely. In fact, Raymond insisted that the director of the foundation maintain an active practice. He believed the foundation should always be led by someone who understands the day-to-day reality of providing healthcare. I thought about Uncle Raymond's letter, his challenge to say yes to something bigger than I'd ever imagined. Then I looked at Catherine, this elegant woman who had somehow become part of Uncle Raymond's master plan for my life. Tell me more, I said. For the next 2 hours, Catherine walked me through every aspect of the foundation's operations. The existing clinics, the funding mechanisms, the legal structure, the staff already in place. By the time she finished, I was beginning to understand the magnitude of what Uncle Raymond had built, and what he was asking me to inherit. There's one more thing, Catherine said as we prepared to leave. Raymond left instructions for me to give you this after you'd heard about the foundation. She handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a key, old-fashioned, ornate, the kind that might open a treasure chest in a fairy tale. Attached to the key was a note. This opens the desk drawer in my study where I kept all my plans for the foundation. Everything you need to know about what we built together is waiting for you there. Welcome to the real work of your life. Uncle Ray. That evening, I drove to Uncle Raymond's house. My house now, I reminded myself, and used the key to open the locked drawer in his study. Inside, I found detailed business plans, financial projections, architectural drawings for future clinics, and a thick folder labeled Rebecca's Foundation. As I read through the documents, I began to understand the true scope of Uncle Raymond's vision. This wasn't just about expanding healthcare access, it was about creating a sustainable model that could be replicated across the country, a network of community-based clinics that could serve as a blueprint for healthcare reform. At the bottom of the folder was one final note. Asterisk Rebecca, by the time you read this, you'll know that your inheritance was never really about the money. The money is just a tool. Your real inheritance is the opportunity to spend your life making a difference on a scale that most people never get to experience. Use it wisely. Make me proud. Uncle Ray asterisk. I sat in his study until well past midnight, reading through his plans, his dreams, his carefully orchestrated strategy for turning me into someone capable of carrying on his work. As I finally prepared to leave, I looked around the room that had always intimidated me, all those books on quantum physics and sustainable energy and complex business theories. Now I understood. Uncle Raymond hadn't been collecting knowledge for himself. He'd been building a library for me, preparing me for a life I couldn't have imagined when I was that heartbroken nurse living above a laundromat. 3 days later, I signed the papers transferring control of the foundation to me. Catherine organized a small ceremony in Mr. Whitmore's office, and as I put my signature on the legal documents, I felt Uncle Raymond's presence so strongly it was like he was standing beside me. "Congratulations," Catherine said as we shook hands afterward. "You're now officially the director of the Martinez Foundation for Community Healthcare." The Martinez Foundation. Uncle Raymond had named it after our family, ensuring that his legacy, and mine, would be tied to this work forever. As I drove home that evening, I passed the community clinic where I'd worked for so many years. It looked smaller somehow, though I knew nothing about the building had changed. What had changed was my perspective on what was possible. Tomorrow, I would give my notice at the clinic, not because I was leaving healthcare, but because I was expanding into it on a scale I'd never dreamed possible. The little clinic would be the first one to benefit from foundation support, ensuring that the work I'd started there could continue and grow. I thought about Marcus, wherever he was in Los Angeles, probably still trying to figure out how he'd so completely miscalculated the situation. He'd seen dollar signs and thought he could manipulate his way back into my life. He'd never understood that the real prize wasn't the money, it was the opportunity to use that money to change the world. Uncle Raymond had been right about everything. The money didn't change who I was, it amplified who I was. And who I was, it turned out, was someone who'd been preparing her entire adult life to take on the challenge he'd left for me. 6 months into my new role as director of the Martinez Foundation, I had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and revolutionary. I was still practicing medicine, but now I split my time between the original community clinic, which had become our flagship location, and traveling to oversee our other facilities and plan new ones. Catherine had been right about the steep learning curve. Running a multi-million-dollar foundation involved skills I'd never needed as a nurse practitioner: strategic planning, board management, donor relations, and the complex art of scaling healthcare delivery. But I discovered that my years of working in under-resourced environments had given me an intuitive understanding of what communities actually needed, as opposed to what looked good in grant applications. We'd already broken ground on 2 new clinics, one in rural Alabama and another in urban Phoenix, and I was in preliminary talks with community leaders in 6 other states about potential locations. The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, exactly the kind of meaningful challenge Uncle Raymond had known I needed. I was in my office at the Foundation's headquarters, a renovated warehouse that Catherine had helped me transform into a functional workspace, when my assistant, Jennifer, buzzed in with a concerned tone. "Rebecca, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent and personal." Something in her voice made my stomach drop. "Did he give a name?" "Marcus Thompson. He says he's your ex-husband." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. It had been 6 months since the will reading, 6 months of blessed silence from my past. I'd almost convinced myself that Marcus had accepted the finality of our encounter with Mr. Whitmore. "Send him in," I said, steeling myself for whatever new angle he was planning to try. But the man who walked into my office looked nothing like the polished, confident version of Marcus I'd seen at the will reading. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Most striking of all, the calculating charm that had always been his trademark was nowhere to be seen. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on my name. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to the chair across from my desk but didn't stand up. "What do you want, Marcus?" He sat down heavily, like a man carrying a weight too large for his frame. "I wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not the performance I gave you 6 months ago. You drove from Los Angeles to apologize." "I flew," he said absently. "Rebecca, my life has completely fallen apart since that day in the lawyer's office. I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you, what I threw away, and I'm sorrier than you can possibly imagine." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but all I saw was genuine despair. "What happened, Marcus?" He laughed bitterly. "Everything. Clarissa left me 3 months ago. She took half my assets in the divorce, including the house in Malibu and most of my investment accounts. My business is under investigation for securities fraud, not because I did anything illegal, but because one of my partners was embezzling client funds and I was too focused on other things to notice." I felt a flicker of sympathy despite myself. "I'm sorry to hear that. The worst part is, none of it would have happened if I'd been a different kind of person. The kind of person who valued loyalty and character over opportunity. The kind of person who would have recognized what I had with you and protected it." He looked around my office, taking in the photographs of our clinics, the awards we'd received for our work, the evidence of a life built on purpose rather than profit. "I researched what you've been doing," he continued. "The foundation, the clinics, the lives you're changing. You've become exactly who I always knew you could be, and I became exactly who I was afraid I might be." There was something different about him now, a humility I'd never seen before. The Marcus I'd known had been incapable of admitting failure or acknowledging that his choices had consequences he couldn't control. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I needed you to know that your uncle was right about me. Every word in that letter, every prediction he made, all of it was true. I did show up because of the money. I was exactly the kind of person he said I was." Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "But losing everything has given me some perspective on what I actually lost when I left you." "Which was?" "The chance to be part of something meaningful. The opportunity to build a life with someone who saw the world the way you do, who cared about making things better instead of just making things bigger." I was quiet for a long moment, processing this new version of Marcus. "You hurt me very deeply," I said finally. "Not just by leaving, but by the way you left. The note, the complete absence of explanation or consideration for what I might be going through. I know. I was a coward. I convinced myself that a clean break would be easier for both of us, but the truth is, I didn't want to face what I was doing to you because I knew it was wrong." "And what exactly do you want from me now?" Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Nothing. I don't want anything from you, Rebecca. I can't ask for forgiveness because what I did was unforgivable. I can't ask for a second chance because I already had one and I wasted it. I just wanted you to know that I see clearly now what I couldn't see then." He stood up slowly, like an old man despite being only in his early 40s. "I wanted you to know that every success you've had, every life you've touched, every person you've helped, you did all of that despite what I put you through, not because of it. And I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be." As he moved toward the door, I found myself speaking before I'd fully decided what I wanted to say. "Marcus, wait." He turned back, hope flickering briefly in his eyes. "I appreciate the apology. I really do. And I can see that you're genuinely sorry for how things ended between us. But," he said, reading the tone in my voice, "but sorry doesn't undo 13 years. It doesn't give me back the years I spent rebuilding my life from scratch, or the sleepless nights wondering what was wrong with me that someone could just walk away so easily. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. More importantly, I've learned something about myself over the past few months. I like who I've become. I like the life I've built. I like the person I am when I'm not trying to be half of something else. When I turned back to face him, Marcus was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I forgive you," I said, and I realized as I spoke the words that I meant them. "Not for your benefit, but for mine. I'm tired of carrying anger around like a weight. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm choosing to let go of the past so I can fully embrace my future." Marcus nodded, and I could see tears in his eyes. "That's more than I deserved." "Yes, it is. But it's also what I needed to give." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it meant. The Marcus who had just walked out of my life was fundamentally different from the one who had walked into it 6 months ago. Losing everything had humbled him in a way that success never could have. But Uncle Raymond had been right about something else too. People who show up because of money rarely stay for the right reasons. Even this new, humbled version of Marcus had only appeared after his comfortable life had imploded. When he'd been successful and happily remarried, he'd never spared a thought for the wife he'd abandoned. That evening, I called Catherine to tell her about Marcus's visit. "How do you feel about seeing him again?" she asked. "Surprisingly at peace," I said. "I think I needed to see that chapter fully close. And it has, completely and finally. Raymond would be proud of how you handled that." I smiled, thinking about Uncle Raymond's letter, his perfect understanding of how people like Marcus operated. I think he would be. He always said that success reveals character rather than creating it. Marcus's failure revealed character too, and so did my response to it. The next morning brought news that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Jennifer buzzed in to tell me that the MacArthur Foundation was on the phone. They wanted to discuss our application for a significant grant to expand our mobile clinic program. As I took the call, I looked around my office at the photographs of patients we'd helped, communities we'd served, lives we'd touched. This was Uncle Raymond's real gift to me, not the money, but the platform to make a difference on a scale I'd never imagined possible. The money had been a tool, just like he'd always said. The real inheritance was the opportunity to spend my life doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who shared my values and commitment to service. Marcus was part of my past now, a chapter that had finally been written and closed. My future stretched ahead of me like an open road, full of possibilities I was only beginning to explore. And for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years had passed since Marcus's final visit to my office, and I had settled completely into my new identity as a foundation director and healthcare advocate. The Martinez Foundation was now operating 12 clinics across 7 states, and we'd received national recognition for our innovative approaches to community-based healthcare delivery. I was in Washington, D.C., for a conference on healthcare policy reform, staying at a hotel near Capitol Hill, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Martinez? This is Detective Sarah Reeves with the Los Angeles Police Department. I'm calling about Marcus Thompson. I understand you were formerly married to him." My blood ran cold. "Yes, we were divorced about 15 years ago. Has something happened to him?" "Mr. Thompson was found dead in his apartment yesterday morning. We're investigating the circumstances, and his phone records show several recent calls to your number. We'd like to speak with you if possible." I sank into the hotel room chair, my mind reeling. "Dead? How?" "It appears to be suicide. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. Would it be possible for you to come to Los Angeles, or could we arrange a phone interview?" I scheduled a phone call for the following morning and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to process this news. Marcus had seemed despondent during our last meeting, but I'd assumed he would eventually rebuild his life the way I had after he left me. The idea that he'd been so broken by his failures that he'd taken his own life was devastating in ways I hadn't expected. The The call with Detective Reeves revealed details that painted a picture of a man who had spiraled far further than I'd realized. After his divorce from Clarissa, Marcus had lost his investment firm, his house, and most of his savings to legal fees and settlements related to his partner's embezzlement. He'd been living in a studio apartment, working as a financial advisor for a small firm, making barely enough to cover his basic expenses. "The reason we're calling you," Detective Reeves explained, "is that Mr. Thompson left several items specifically designated for you. There's a letter and some personal effects. Would you like us to mail them, or would you prefer to pick them up?" Against my better judgment, I flew to Los Angeles the next day. Something about Marcus's death had shaken me profoundly, and I needed to understand what had driven him to such a desperate final choice. The detective who met me at the police station was a woman about my age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She handed me a manila envelope with my name written on it in Marcus's familiar handwriting. "He also left instructions for you to have these," she said, producing a small jewelry box. "His neighbor found him yesterday morning after he failed to show up for work. He'd been struggling financially for some time, according to the people we interviewed." I opened the jewelry box first and gasped. Inside was the engagement ring Marcus had given me 20 years ago, the small diamond on a silver band that he'd saved 8 months to buy. I'd given it back to him when he left, telling him to sell it since he clearly needed the money more than I needed the reminder. The letter was several pages long, written in the careful script I remembered from our marriage. Asterisk, "My dearest Rebecca, asterisk. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then I've finally stopped running from the consequences of my choices. I want you to know that this decision isn't about you. It's about me, and my inability to live with who I became. Asterisk. Asterisk, I've spent the last 2 years thinking about our conversation in your office, about the life you've built, about the person you became after I left you. You told me that you liked who you were when you weren't trying to be half of something else, and I realized that I never learned how to be a whole person on my own. Asterisk. Asterisk, when I left you, I thought I was choosing freedom and opportunity. What I was actually choosing was a life built on the wrong foundation. Every success I had after leaving you was hollow because it was achieved by abandoning the best part of myself, the part that loved you genuinely and completely. Asterisk. Asterisk, Clarissa never loved me the way you did. I know that now. She loved my success, my earning potential, my ability to provide her with the lifestyle she wanted. When those things disappeared, so did she. But you loved me when I drove a used Honda and wore discount store ties. You loved the person I was before I became obsessed with the person I thought I needed to be. Asterisk. Asterisk, I want you to know that every day since I left you has been a lesson in regret. Not just regret about losing you, but regret about becoming someone I don't recognize or respect. The man who walked out on you was a stranger wearing my face, driven by fears and ambitions I should have been strong enough to resist. Asterisk. Asterisk, I know you've forgiven me, because that's who you are. But I've never been able to forgive myself. I've lived with the knowledge that I had everything, a woman who loved me unconditionally, a chance to build something meaningful together, the opportunity to be part of your remarkable journey, and I threw it all away for fool's gold. Asterisk. Asterisk, your uncle saw me clearly from the beginning. He knew I would eventually show up because of your inheritance, and he knew you deserved better than someone who only recognized your value when it came with a price tag. His letter to me was brutal because it was true. I was exactly the kind of person he said I was. Asterisk. Asterisk, but here's what I want you to understand. You were never the problem. You were never too much or not enough or any of the things I probably made you feel when I left. You were perfect exactly as you were, and I was too immature and self-absorbed to appreciate what I had. Asterisk. Asterisk, I'm giving you back the engagement ring because it was the last honest thing I ever gave you. Everything after that, my promises, my explanations, my recent apology, was tainted by my own agenda. But that ring represents who I was when I loved you purely, before I let success and ambition poison everything good in my life. Asterisk. Asterisk, I don't expect you to mourn me. I don't deserve your tears or your grief. What I hope is that you'll remember the good times we had before I ruined everything, and that you'll continue to build the extraordinary life you've created. The world needs more people like you, Rebecca. It needs fewer people like me. Asterisk. Asterisk, please don't let my failures cast any shadow on your future. Find someone who sees you as both the journey and the destination, like your uncle said you deserved. Be happy. Be loved. Be everything I was too stupid to cherish when I had the chance. Asterisk. Asterisk, with all the love I should have shown you when it mattered. Asterisk. Asterisk, Marcus. Asterisk. I read the letter twice before I realized I was crying. Not for Marcus, exactly, but for the waste of it all, the years we'd both spent carrying damage from our failed marriage, the life he might have built if he'd been able to face his mistakes and grow from them instead of being crushed by them. Detective Reeves offered me tissues and waited patiently while I composed myself. Were you able to determine what specifically triggered this? I asked finally. She consulted her notes. He'd been struggling financially since his divorce, but the immediate trigger seems to have been learning about an award you received. We found several news articles about your foundation printed out in his apartment. There was one about you being named Healthcare Advocate of the Year by the National Association of Community Health Centers. I remembered that award ceremony. It had been one of the proudest moments of my professional life, standing on a stage in front of hundreds of healthcare professionals, talking about the work we were doing and the lives we were changing. Uncle Raymond would have been so proud. It seems like seeing your continued success while his life fell apart was more than he could handle, the detective continued gently. I thought about Marcus's letter, his belief that he didn't deserve to mourn. The truth was, I did mourn him, not the man who had left me with a note and disappeared, but the young man I'd once loved who had dreams of making something meaningful of his life. That person had died long before Marcus took his own life, killed by his own choices and priorities. Flying back to Denver, I found myself thinking about Uncle Raymond's prediction that inheriting money would bring people from my past back into my life. He'd been right about Marcus showing up, but I don't think even he had anticipated this final, tragic conclusion to our story. When I got home, I called Catherine to tell her what had happened. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. Even after everything he put you through, this must be difficult. It is, I admitted. I keep thinking about what might have been different if he'd made different choices, or if I'd been able to help him somehow. You can't save someone from themselves, Catherine said gently. Marcus had every advantage: intelligence, education, opportunities, and at one point, a woman who loved him deeply. His failures weren't about lacking resources, they were about lacking character. That night, I sat in Uncle Raymond's study, my study now, looking at the engagement ring Marcus had returned to me. It was such a small thing, this modest diamond that had once represented our hopes for the future. Now it felt like an artifact from a different lifetime, a relic of two people who no longer existed. I thought about Uncle Raymond's final instructions to me, his challenge to use my inheritance to amplify who I really was. The past 2 years had shown me that I was someone who found purpose in service, strength in adversity, and joy in making a difference in other people's lives. Marcus had been someone else entirely, someone who found validation in external success, identity in others' admiration, and meaning in accumulation rather than contribution. In the end, when those external sources of worth disappeared, he'd had nothing left to sustain him. I opened the jewelry box one more time, looking at the ring that represented both a beginning and an ending. Then I closed it and put it away in Uncle Raymond's desk drawer, next to the $3 check he'd left for Marcus at the will reading. Some chapters of our lives end with closure and resolution. Others end with tragedy and regret. But the beauty of being alive is that even when one chapter ends badly, we can still write new chapters filled with meaning and hope. Marcus's story was over now, but mine was still being written. And I intended to make it count. 5 years after Uncle Raymond's death, I stood in the auditorium of the Denver Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 500 healthcare professionals who had gathered for the annual Martinez Foundation Summit. It was our largest conference yet, bringing together community health workers, policymakers, and advocates from across the country to share best practices and plan collaborative initiatives. Dr. Chen, who had joined the foundation as my deputy director 2 years earlier, was introducing me to deliver the keynote address. As I listened to her list our accomplishments, 28 clinics across 14 states, over 500,000 patients served, hundreds of healthcare scholarships awarded, I felt Uncle Raymond's presence so strongly it was like he was standing beside me at the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah concluded. Please join me in welcoming the founder and director of the Martinez Foundation, Dr. Rebecca Martinez. The title still felt new. I'd completed my doctorate in public health administration 2 years earlier, writing my dissertation on sustainable models for community-based healthcare delivery. Uncle Raymond had been right when he'd stocked his study with books on subjects I'd thought I'd never need to understand: business management, policy development, systems thinking. I'd ended up reading every single one. As I approached the microphone, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 15 years ago, I'd been a heartbroken nurse living above a laundromat, wondering if I'd ever find my place in the world. Now I was addressing an audience of professionals who looked to me for leadership and inspiration. When I was 31 years old, I thought my life was over. My husband had left me with nothing but debt and a note. I was working double shifts just to survive, and I couldn't imagine a future that held anything more than just getting by from day to day. The audience was silent, listening intently. I'd learned over the years that vulnerability was one of the most powerful tools a leader could wield, not the kind of calculated vulnerability that manipulates, but the genuine kind that connects us to our shared humanity. What I couldn't see then was that ending was actually a beginning. Sometimes we have to lose the life we planned in order to find the life we're meant to live. I talked about Uncle Raymond's influence on my life, about the gradual process of rebuilding after betrayal, about learning to see setbacks as opportunities for growth. I shared stories from our clinics: the diabetic grandmother in rural Kentucky who could finally afford her medication, the teenage mother in inner-city Detroit who received prenatal care that saved both her life and her baby's, the migrant worker in New Mexico whose infected wound was treated before it could become life-threatening. These stories matter because they remind us why we chose healthcare as our calling. We didn't go into this field to get rich or famous. We chose it because we believe every person deserves access to dignity, compassion, and quality care, regardless of their ability to pay. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most were the faces in the audience. Nurses and doctors and administrators who had dedicated their lives to serving others, who understood the challenges and rewards of working with underserved populations. After my speech, I spent the rest of the day in workshops and meetings, discussing everything from telemedicine innovations to policy advocacy strategies. During a break between sessions, I stepped outside for some fresh air and found myself thinking about Marcus. It had been 3 years since his death, and I rarely thought about him anymore except when a song we used to listen to, a restaurant we'd visited, a news story about financial fraud, brought him unexpectedly to mind. Time had given me perspective on our relationship and its aftermath. I could see now that we'd both been young and unformed, trying to build something permanent out of materials that were still shifting and changing. The tragedy wasn't that our marriage ended. Many marriages end, and people move on to build happy, fulfilling lives. The tragedy was that Marcus had never learned to find worth and meaning within himself, independent of external validation. When his career and second marriage collapsed, he'd had no internal foundation to sustain him. Rebecca. I turned to see a young woman approaching me, probably in her late 20s, with a kind of earnest expression I associated with people who had important things to say. "I'm Amanda Foster," she said, extending her hand. "I'm a nurse practitioner at one of your clinics in rural Ohio. I wanted to thank you for what you've built." "Thank you, but I can't take credit for what happens in the clinics. That's all the work of people like you who show up every day to serve your communities." Amanda smiled. "That's exactly what I mean. You could have just written checks from your inheritance and called it philanthropy. Instead, you built something that empowers the rest of us to do our best work." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph of a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "This is Maya. She's been my patient since she was 2. When she first came to our clinic, she had severe asthma that wasn't being managed because her family couldn't afford regular care. We've been able to get her the medication and treatment she needs, and now she's healthy and thriving in school." I looked at the photograph, feeling the familiar warmth that came from seeing the human impact of our work. "Maya's mother asked me to give you something if I ever met you," Amanda continued. She reached into her purse and pulled out a hand-drawn card. On the front, in crayon, was a picture of a woman in a white coat with a stethoscope around her neck. Inside, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for helping me breathe better. Love, Maya." I felt tears prick my eyes as I held this precious gift from a little girl I'd never met but whose life had been touched by the foundation Uncle Raymond had envisioned. "Please tell Maya that her card is going on my office wall," I said. "And tell her that she's the reason we do this work." That evening, the foundation hosted a reception for conference attendees. As I moved through the crowd, talking with clinicians and advocates and policymakers, I was struck by the sense of community we'd created. These weren't just employees or contractors, they were partners in a shared mission, people who had found their calling in serving others. Catherine, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, found me near the end of the evening. "Raymond would be so proud," she said, echoing the thought I'd been carrying all day. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm living up to his vision." "Oh, my dear, you've exceeded his vision. He imagined you'd run a foundation that operated clinics. He never imagined you'd become a national voice for healthcare reform, or that you'd inspire this kind of movement." It was true that the foundation had evolved beyond Uncle Raymond's initial plans. We weren't just operating clinics anymore, we were training healthcare providers, conducting research, advocating for policy changes, and serving as a model that other organizations were replicating across the country. "Can I tell you something he never told you?" Catherine asked. I nodded, always eager to hear stories about Uncle Raymond that I hadn't heard before. About a year before he died, when we were working on the foundation structure, he told me that he wasn't leaving you money, he was leaving you a mission. He said the money would give you the freedom to become who you were meant to be, but the real gift was the opportunity to spend your life making a difference. She paused, looking around the reception at all the people whose lives had been touched by Uncle Raymond's vision. He also said something else. He said that losing Marcus was the best thing that ever happened to you, because it forced you to discover your own strength and purpose. If you'd stayed married to someone who saw you as a supporting character in his story, you never would have become the protagonist of your own. I thought about that as the reception wound down and people began to leave. Uncle Raymond had been right about so many things. Marcus's eventual return, the way money would change how people saw me, the challenges and opportunities that would come with sudden wealth. But perhaps his greatest insight was understanding that my divorce wasn't a failure to recover from, but a liberation that would eventually lead me to my true calling. As I drove home through the quiet Denver streets, I thought about the life I'd built since that terrible night 15 years ago when Marcus had told me he couldn't do this anymore. I'd rebuilt everything, my career, my sense of self, my understanding of what mattered most. But more than that, I'd discovered that the life I'd thought I wanted wasn't nearly as meaningful as the life I'd actually created. I was 46 years old, single, and happier than I'd ever been. I had work that filled me with purpose, colleagues who had become like family, and the resources to make a real difference in the world. I'd found love in unexpected places, in the gratitude of patients I'd never meet, in the dedication of healthcare workers who shared my values, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I was living up to Uncle Raymond's faith in me. The house in the hills that Uncle Raymond had left me had become my sanctuary, filled with books and plans and photographs from our clinics. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in his study and talk to him about challenges we were facing or successes we'd achieved. I knew he couldn't hear me, but somehow I always felt like he was listening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, funding applications to write, policy meetings to attend, clinics to visit, staff to support. But tonight, driving through the city where I'd rebuilt my life, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Marcus had been wrong about so many things, but he'd been right about one. I had become exactly who I was always meant to be. The difference was, I'd done it not in spite of his abandonment, but because of it. And that made all the difference in the world. 10 years after Uncle Raymond's death, I received a phone call that would bring my story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. I was in my office at the foundation, reviewing applications for our expanded scholarship program, when Jennifer buzzed in with an unusual request. "Rebecca, there's a young man here who says he's Marcus Thompson's son. He'd like to speak with you if you have time." My heart stopped. Marcus's son. I hadn't known he'd had children with Clarissa. I deliberately avoided seeking information about his life after our divorce. The idea that there was a person in the world who carried half of Marcus's DNA, who might have inherited his charm and intelligence along with his capacity for self-destruction, was both intriguing and unsettling. "Send him in," I said, bracing myself for whatever this encounter might bring. The young man who walked into my office looked so much like Marcus at 25 that I actually gasped. Same green eyes, same thick dark hair, same tall, athletic build. But where Marcus had always carried himself with calculated confidence, this young man seemed genuinely nervous, almost shy. "Ms. Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Thompson. Thank you for agreeing to see me." His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his voice warm but respectful. Whatever else he might have inherited from his father, it wasn't the manipulative charm that had been Marcus's signature trait. "Please, sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "I have to say, you look remarkably like your father." David's expression grew somber. "I know. It's been both a blessing and a curse, especially after everything that happened." "I was very sorry to hear about his death," I said, meaning it. "I know the circumstances were difficult." "Thank you. That's actually part of why I'm here." David reached into a backpack and pulled out a manila envelope. "When my father died, he left some things specifically for me to give to you. I've been carrying them around for 3 years, trying to work up the courage to contact you." I looked at the envelope, wondering what final message Marcus might have left for me beyond the letter I'd already received from the police. "Before I give you this," David continued, "I want you to know that I'm not here because I want anything from you. I know about your inheritance, about the foundation, about the life you've built. I'm not asking for money or trying to claim any connection to Uncle Raymond's estate." The fact that he called Uncle Raymond by that title, despite having barely known him, suggested that Marcus had at least talked about our family relationships during his son's childhood. "Then why are you here?" I asked gently. David was quiet for a moment, clearly gathering his thoughts. "Because I need to understand who my father really was. And because I think you might be the only person who knew him before he became, whatever he became at the end." I studied this young man's face, seeing so much of Marcus in his features but something entirely different in his expression. Where Marcus had been calculating, David seemed genuinely curious. Where Marcus had been entitled, David appeared humble. "How old are you, David?" 23. I graduated from college last year with a degree in social work. I'm working at a community center in Portland, helping at-risk teenagers. Social work. Community service. A career dedicated to helping people rather than accumulating wealth. Either David had deliberately chosen a path that was the opposite of his father's, or he'd inherited whatever capacity for compassion Marcus had possessed but lost along the way. "Tell me about your childhood," I said. "What was Marcus like as a father?" David's expression grew complex. Complicated. He was ambitious, always working, always focused on building his business and making more money. But he was also, I don't know how to explain it. Sometimes he'd get this look, like he was remembering something that made him sad. My mother used to say he was haunted by his past. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in his lap. When I was about 12, I asked him why he never talked about his first wife. "My mother had mentioned you a few times, always in a dismissive way, but I could tell there was more to the story." "What did he tell you?" "He said that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life when he was young, and that he'd been trying to make up for it ever since. He said he'd let go of the best thing that ever happened to him because he was too stupid and selfish to recognize what he had." I felt a pang of sadness, thinking about Marcus carrying that regret throughout his second marriage and his relationship with his son. As I got older and learned more about what happened between you two, I started to understand that my father never forgave himself for how he treated you. I think it colored everything else he did, every choice he made afterward. David reached for the envelope and placed it on my desk. After he died, I found this hidden in his desk, along with a letter explaining that these were things that belonged to you, things he should have returned years ago. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, Pictures from our marriage that I'd assumed were lost forever when Marcus left. Our wedding day, vacations we'd taken, quiet moments at home that someone had captured on film. At the bottom of the stack was a small notebook I recognized immediately, the journal I'd kept during nursing school, where I'd written about my dreams of someday opening a community clinic. He kept all of this? I asked, overwhelmed by the evidence of Marcus carrying pieces of our life together for all those years. He did. And there's something else. David pulled a letter from his backpack. This was attached to the envelope. It's addressed to me, but it's about you. He handed me the letter, and I recognized Marcus's handwriting immediately. David, by the time you read this, you'll know that I chose to end my life rather than face the consequences of my failures. I hope someday you'll understand that this decision was about my inability to live with who I became, not about any lack of love for you. I want to tell you about Rebecca Martinez, who was Rebecca Thompson when I knew her best. She was my first wife, and losing her was the single greatest mistake of my life. Everything that went wrong afterward, my failed second marriage, my business problems, my inability to find peace or happiness, can be traced back to the moment I walked away from the best woman I've ever known. Rebecca was everything I should have valued but was too immature to appreciate. Kind, compassionate, brilliant, hardworking, and genuinely good in a way that's rare in this world. She worked double shifts as a nurse to help pay for my business school, never complained about our tiny apartment or our second-hand furniture, and believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I left her because I was seduced by the idea of success, by a woman who represented the kind of life I thought I wanted. I told myself that Rebecca was holding me back, that I needed someone more sophisticated, more ambitious, more. I don't even know what I thought I needed. What I actually needed was someone who loved me for who I was, not what I could become. When I left Rebecca, I destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. She didn't deserve the way I ended our marriage, with a note, like she was an inconvenience rather than a woman I'd promised to love forever. The pain I caused her haunted me for the rest of my life, and knowing that I was capable of such cruelty changed how I saw myself fundamentally. I need you to find Rebecca and give her the photographs and journal I kept. They belong to her, and I should have returned them years ago. More importantly, I need you to see the kind of person she became after I left her, because she represents everything I failed to be. Rebecca rebuilt her life completely after our divorce. She went back to school, became a nurse practitioner, dedicated herself to helping people who couldn't afford healthcare. When her uncle died and left her a fortune, she could have retired and lived a life of leisure. Instead, she created a foundation that operates clinics across the country, providing healthcare to hundreds of thousands of people. She became successful not by climbing over other people or prioritizing profit over principles, but by staying true to her values and working to make the world better. She found meaning and purpose in service to others. She became the kind of person who makes the world brighter just by being in it. David, you have a choice to make about what kind of man you want to become. You can follow my path, chasing external validation, prioritizing material success over character, treating people as stepping stones rather than human beings deserving of respect and loyalty. Or you can follow Rebecca's path, building a life based on service, compassion, and genuine contribution to the world. I pray you choose her path. Be the kind of person who keeps promises. Be someone who sees the value in others and protects it rather than exploiting it. Be everything I should have been but was too weak and selfish to become. If you ever have the courage to contact Rebecca, tell her that I never stopped loving her, and that I never stopped regretting the way I treated her. Tell her that watching her succeed from afar was both my greatest joy and my deepest shame. Joy because she deserved every happiness, shame because I had thrown away the chance to be part of it. Learn from my mistakes, son. Be better than I was. With all my love and all my regrets. Your father. I finished reading the letter with tears streaming down my face. Not tears of grief for Marcus, exactly, but tears for the waste of it all, for the young man who had once had so much potential, for the years we'd all lost to his poor choices, for the pain he'd carried that had ultimately consumed him. David was watching me with an expression of deep concern. "Are you okay?" I wiped my eyes and nodded. "Thank you for bringing me these things. And thank you for sharing your father's letter. It helps me understand what he was going through at the end." "Can I ask you something?" David said hesitantly. "Of course." "My father wrote that you became successful by staying true to your values. But from what I've read about you, about the foundation and all the work you've done, it seems like you became something more than successful. You became, I don't know how to put it, important. Like your life really matters." I considered his words, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. "I think what your father meant was that success isn't just about achieving your goals, it's about choosing the right goals to begin with. When I was younger, I thought success meant having a stable marriage and a comfortable life. After your father left, I had to figure out what actually mattered to me." "And what did you discover?" "That meaning comes from contribution. That the most fulfilling life is one spent in service to something larger than yourself. That true success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give away." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I'm trying to figure out for myself. I chose social work because I want to help people, but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm making a real difference." I looked at this young man, Marcus's son, but clearly someone who had chosen a very different path than his father had taken. "Tell me about your work." For the next hour, David told me about the community center where he worked, the teenagers he counseled, the programs he developed to help at-risk youth stay in school and out of trouble. As he spoke, his face lit up with the kind of passion I recognized in all the healthcare workers who joined our foundation, the unmistakable joy that comes from work that aligns with your values. "David," I said when he finished, "you're already making a real difference. The teenagers you're helping today will grow up to be adults who remember that someone cared about them, someone believed in them. That kind of impact ripples out in ways you may never fully see. But it feels so small compared to what you've accomplished. Every meaningful change starts small. I began by taking care of one patient at a time. You're changing one life at a time. That's exactly how the world gets better." As our conversation began to wind down, I found myself making an unexpected decision. "David, would you be interested in learning more about the Foundation's work? We're always looking for people with your background and values." His eyes widened. "You'd consider hiring me?" "I'd consider a lot of things. We have community outreach programs that could use someone with your experience. We fund youth health initiatives that would benefit from your perspective. There might be opportunities for you to contribute to our work while continuing to serve the populations you're passionate about." David was quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Martinez, I don't want you to offer me a job because you feel sorry for me, or because of who my father was." I smiled, recognizing the integrity in his response. "David, I would never hire someone out of pity. I'm making this offer because I can see that you have the values and passion we need, and because I think you could help us serve communities better. Your father's identity has nothing to do with your qualifications." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "I'd like to learn more." I pulled out my business card and wrote my personal cell phone number on the back. "Call me next week. We can discuss possibilities." As David prepared to leave, he turned back to me one more time. "Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if my father had made different choices? If he'd stayed with you, or if he'd found a way to become the person he wrote about in that letter?" I thought about his question, one I'd asked myself many times over the years. I used to wonder about that a lot. But I've come to believe that everything happened exactly as it needed to. If your father had stayed, I might never have discovered my own strength. I might never have built the life I was meant to live. So you don't regret any of it? I regret the pain, both his and mine. But I don't regret the journey. It led me to work I love, to people I care about, to a sense of purpose I never would have found otherwise. David smiled, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that reminded me not of Marcus, but of Uncle Raymond, a kind of wise understanding that transcended his years. "I think I understand now why my father never got over losing you," he said. "You didn't just rebuild your life after he left, you built a better life. You became someone he could never deserve but never stopped wanting to be worthy of." After David left, I sat in my office holding the photographs he'd returned to me, looking at images of a younger version of myself who had no idea what lay ahead. That woman in the wedding photos looked so hopeful, so certain that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. She had no way of knowing that her husband would abandon her, that she'd spend years rebuilding from scratch, that she'd eventually inherit a fortune and use it to change thousands of lives. But perhaps that was the most remarkable part of the human experience, our inability to see where our current struggles are leading us, the way our greatest disasters often become the catalysts for our most meaningful achievements. I thought about Uncle Raymond, who had seen my potential long before I'd recognized it myself. He'd known that losing Marcus was a gift, not a tragedy, because it would force me to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to be half of something else. I thought about Marcus, who had spent the last years of his life watching from afar as I became the person he'd never had the courage to become himself. His tragedy wasn't that he'd made mistakes. We all make mistakes. His tragedy was that he'd never learned to forgive himself, never found a way to build something meaningful from the ashes of his poor choices. And I thought about David, this young man who carried his father's DNA but had somehow escaped his father's destructive patterns. Perhaps Marcus's greatest success hadn't been his financial achievements, but raising a son who had chosen compassion over ambition, service over self-interest. That evening, I called Catherine to tell her about David's visit. "How remarkable," she said after I'd shared the story. "It's like Raymond's influence is still rippling outward, even 10 years after his death." She was right. Uncle Raymond had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who'd received care at our clinics. And now, potentially, his influence might touch David's life as well, helping Marcus's son find his own path to meaningful contribution. "I keep thinking about that letter Marcus wrote to David," I told Catherine. "He understood, at the end, what he'd lost. He saw clearly what I'd become and what he'd failed to become. But by then it was too late for him to change course." "Some people learn from their mistakes," Catherine said. "Others are crushed by them. Marcus chose to be crushed. You chose to learn. That's what made all the difference." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. 15 years ago, I'd been a heartbroken woman wondering if her life had any meaning or purpose. Tonight, I was the director of a foundation that had touched hundreds of thousands of lives, with resources to continue that work for decades to come. But perhaps more importantly, I'd become someone who understood that our greatest growth often comes from our deepest pain, that our most meaningful contributions can emerge from our most devastating losses, and that the life we think we want is rarely as fulfilling as the life we build when we're forced to discover our own strength. Marcus had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. I had become someone he could never deserve. Not because I was superior to him, but because I'd learned to find worth and meaning in service rather than accumulation, in contribution rather than consumption. The $3 check Uncle Raymond had left for Marcus was still in my desk drawer, along with the engagement ring David had returned to me. Tomorrow, I would frame them together as a reminder of where I'd come from and how far I'd traveled. But tonight, I would simply be grateful for the extraordinary privilege of living a life that mattered, of waking up each morning with work to do that made the world a little bit better. Uncle Raymond had been right about everything. The money hadn't changed who I was, it had amplified who I was. And who I was, it turned out, was exactly who I'd been meant to become all along. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, your bedroom, your car, your office during a break, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and tell me your location. Stories like these remind us that our worst moments often become the foundations for our best lives, that what looks like an ending is often actually a beginning. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own journey of rebuilding and growth, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about resilience, revenge, and the extraordinary things that happen when we refuse to let our circumstances define us. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their current chapter isn't their final chapter. And remember, success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. It's about who you become when life forces you to discover your own strength. Until next time, keep believing in second chances, keep building something meaningful, and keep becoming the person you're meant to be.